Bible that says what God wants you to do is to make sure they respond to you in a healthy way. No. Every command in the entire Bible is one-sided. If you hear it, it's for you. In Ephesians chapter 5, it says, wives, submit to your husbands. It says, wives, submit to your husbands, and it says, husbands, love your wives. And it's a bad husband who says, wife, you submit to me. And it's a bad wife who says, husband, you need to love me this way. Instead, the Bible is one-sided. It says the husbands you love, the wives you respect, and do your own job and do it well and do it all the way. See, the Bible goes one-sided on all of its commands. And so when it comes to conflict resolution, so many of us want to blame the other person. So many of us want to just point our finger at the other person and say, they're the problem. I've been trying my best. They're the problem. And God says, no, that's the problem. Take a look at what Matthew 22 says. Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Let me ask you, what's the standard in this passage for our love? The standard for my love to God is simply this: all of me. The standard for how I love other people is simply this: as myself. See, this is one-sided. I take everything I want, all the love that I want, and that's what I give. I take everything that I have, all that I am, and that's how I love God. Complete, total, and utter one-sidedness. So this brings us to our T principle. I've already said it once. If you've thought about it, you could have written it down already. It's simply this: take ownership. Take ownership. The most impressive act of resolution, of conflict reconciliation, happened because God took ownership. There are three ways that I want to talk about us taking ownership. And these three ways, I think, will be challenging for us. I think will be enlightening. One of them is practical. The other two are just difficult. The first one is this: I own what brought us to this point. You know what my tendency is? My tendency is just to blame and write people off. See, this is the way I like to operate. What I want to do is, if someone does something wrong to me, I don't really want to resolve that conflict unless it's like really important. Then I'll go and try to deal with it. But if they've done something bad to me, you know what I generally just want to do in my gut? What I want to do? I want to just write them off. I want to just say, listen, that's not a good friend. I'm not going to spend any more time with them. Listen, that's not a good person for me to hang out with because they made this one little mistake, and I'm just not going to spend any more time with them. I blame them and I write them off. But I want to share with you something that I think kind of opened my eyes to something this last week, kind of surprised me as I thought about this. Do you realize that God took complete ownership of His own part in our conflict with Him? What was God's side of the conflict? You know what God's side of the conflict is between humans and Him? God's side is that His standards are just darn too high. I mean, think about it. God's got really, really high standards. He expects for human beings to be absolutely 100% perfect their entire lives. God's got really high standards. And He is okay with that. And He owns that. He says, yeah, you're darn right I got high standards. I've got really high standards. My standards are perfection. And He's not afraid to own that. In fact, God doesn't reduce His standards when it comes to us. He upholds His standards. Pay attention to how God works. What He has done is He says, my standards are way too high for you. I know that. If I compare your life to my standards, you don't measure up. In fact, your life doesn't measure up so badly that I feel wrath and anger towards you. But I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm not going to lower my standards, but I'm going to send my son. And he's going to walk your earth, and he's going to live with you, and he's going to experience your pain, and he is going to do it right all the way from beginning to end. He's going to show you how to live. And then, at the end of his earthly life, he is going to die and to provide a way for your sins to be completely forgiven and for all of his righteousness to be applied to you. Do you realize what God does? He owns his own part of the problem. He owns his own standards being too high. But instead of lowering his standards, what he does is he makes it possible for you to be lifted up, for you to be brought up. When I look at other people, if I were honest, my standards are way too high. Now, God has a right to have high standards. I don't. Let me tell you something. I am not an always kind of person. But I expect everyone around me to be always kind of people. I expect every driver on every road to follow exactly the same rules that I follow. And if they miss one of them, they're a jerk. I expect everybody around me to talk to me exactly the way I want them to talk to me. I want them to use the right tone of voice. I want them to approach me with the right phrasing of questions. I tell you, I had a sickness in my younger years, and I still have a little bit of this sickness, where when someone asks me a question, I refuse to answer the question until they ask it properly. I do it with my children sometimes, and I've a few times, to my own shame, done it with my wife, and she has corrected me, and I have not done it again. But I expect people to talk to me according to my own standards, and if someone makes one mistake, I hold it against them. I expect people to talk about me to their friends according to my standards. And you know what? I just totally believe that this is biblical. Because see, I'm a believer, and I've read this book, and I know what God says about how people should live. And so if you don't follow this and you miss it somehow, man alive, I've got a firm place to stand to believe you're wrong. And my standards, in my mind, are just as high, if not higher, than God's own standards. Because see, God's standards are perfection. My standards are me. And I try to say, what I say goes. How I read this goes. And you know what the problem is with all of us? We have high standards. But how much energy and time do we spend in lifting other people up? Far too often what we do is we just blame and put down. And what we need to do is we need to own what brought us to the conflict. And what brought us to the conflict, if you did nothing wrong in the conflict, and you can look at yourself in the mirror, and all of your friends and all of your objective friends around you will say, no, you did nothing wrong in this situation. I can tell you something you did wrong. You most likely have not adequately lifted the other person up. You see, that's how God does it. If his standards are too high for us, he owns what brought him to that conflict, and he does what's necessary to lift us up. We should do the same. Here's our second owning that we need to do, and it's that I own the process of reconciliation. I own the process of reconciliation. You know, reconciliation doesn't happen in just a few minutes. I can't just go up to someone, make a phone call and say, we're good, right? And they'd be like, yeah, sure, we're good. That's not real reconciliation. At the most, that's just placating the situation or avoiding the situation or something like that. But reconciliation takes a while. In general, what I like to do is make one valiant gesture towards reconciliation. And if they don't receive that, well, now I just write them off. I'm done. I know this other person has a problem with me, so what I do is I make one phone call and I say, hey, is there anything going on you want to talk about? And they're like, no. I'd be like, cool. and we're done. That's the way I want to operate. I make one gesture where I'm trying to be nice to the other person. I'm trying to do something. I'm trying to bring reconciliation to the situation. I do one thing, and then if they don't respond perfectly, well, then we're done. Instead, what God does is He owns the whole process. Jesus lived for 30 years. 30 years. Not being the Jesus we know. Just being a kid and a teenager, a young adult, a working carpenter, a son, brother, and doing it all well. And then He begins His public ministry, and the Bible starts telling us about His life. And then we begin to see glimpses of who Jesus really is. But in 33 years, only 10% of those years are the things we focus on so much. And He worked the process of just being on this planet, doing what His Father asked Him to do. And then beyond that, think about this. Many of us here in this room came to faith 10 years after we were born, 20 years after we were born, 30 years after we were born, or even longer. What if Jesus stopped pursuing you at 29? I don't know how long it took you, but if it took God 7 years of working on your heart before you came to know Him, and you needed 8, that would have been a problem. Can any of us here in this room say, if God had stopped working on me just 1 year before, would you be here today? Would you have the relationship with Him that you have today? See, here's the thing. God doesn't stop. He keeps opening the door. He keeps coming back. And He keeps saying over and over and over again, come. I'm here. Let's be reconciled. There's one last bit of ownership I want you to do. And it's this. The process isn't over until we each own our future. This whole concept of the process, what it means is that every single conversation I have with the other person, the person I'm in conflict with, I'm not waiting for them to initiate stuff. I own the conversation. I make the phone call, and if they say there's nothing they want to talk about, I own it and say, well, I still feel like there's some unresolved stuff between us, and I'd love to sit down with you anytime you feel comfortable. Can I call you next week? I'd love to sit down with you